Consumer Reports just dropped a bombshell, and if you're thinking about buying a diesel in 2026, you need to hear this before you make a very expensive mistake. 3 diesel engines landed on their worst of the worst list, and the reasons are ugly, costly, and frustrating for owners. These are not internet rumors or forum complaints. This is real-world reliability data, owner reports, and long-term testing all pointing to the same conclusion. Avoid these engines at all costs. First up is the 3.0-liter EcoDiesel V6, and this one hurts because it sounds perfect on paper. Great torque, good fuel economy, and used across popular trucks and SUVs. But Consumer Reports highlights a nightmare pattern of engine failures, emission system breakdowns, and costly repairs that show up way too early. Owners report crankshaft failures, EGR cooler issues, and DEF system problems that can put the vehicle into limp mode without warning. Even worse, many of these failures happen just outside warranty, turning a fuel-saving diesel into a 5-figure repair bill that wipes out any savings you thought you were getting. Next on the list is the Ford 3.2-liter Power Stroke Inline 5 diesel, and this one has quietly built a bad reputation over time. Consumer Reports points to chronic turbocharger failures, oil dilution problems, and overheating issues that simply should not exist in a modern diesel. Owners complain about sluggish performance followed by sudden mechanical failures, and repair costs that escalate fast because parts and labor are anything but cheap. This engine may look tough, but long-term reliability data shows it wears down faster than expected, especially under towing or commercial use, which is exactly what it was marketed for. The third engine on Consumer Reports' avoid list is the GM 2.8-liter Duramax diesel, and this one surprises a lot of people. While Duramax has a strong name, this smaller diesel has been plagued by injector failures, timing chain issues, and emissions-related breakdowns that are both frequent and expensive. Consumer Reports notes that many owners experience repeated check engine lights, loss of power, and DEF system faults that dealers struggle to permanently fix. The engine often feels solid early on, but reliability drops sharply as mileage climbs, turning ownership into a cycle of dealership visits and mounting frustration. What makes these engines especially risky going into 2026 is the growing complexity of emission systems combined with shrinking warranty coverage. Consumer Reports emphasizes that newer diesel regulations are making these already problematic engines even more expensive to maintain. When something fails, it's rarely a simple fix. It's sensors, software updates, and major components all tied together, meaning one issue can trigger a cascade of problems that leave your truck undrivable. If you're shopping for a diesel because you want longevity, durability, and lower long-term costs, these 3 engines completely miss the mark. Consumer Reports data shows that many owners regret their purchase within just a few years, and resale values are already taking a hit as word spreads. Dealers know these engines have issues, and that should tell you everything you need to know before signing paperwork. The scary part is that many buyers are still being sold on torque numbers and fuel economy claims without being warned about the reliability risks lurking underneath. If you plan to keep your vehicle past the warranty period, tow regularly, or rely on it as a daily workhorse, choosing the wrong diesel engine could lock you into years of stress and unexpected expenses, especially as repair costs continue to rise and parts availability becomes more unpredictable, which is why understanding what Consumer Reports found next could save you from making the same mistake thousands of owners already regret. And this is where things get even more concerning, because Consumer Reports didn't just look at failures, they looked at patterns. These engines aren't failing once and being fixed for good. They're failing repeatedly, often in different ways, which means owners are stuck in an endless loop of repairs. One month it's an emissions sensor, the next it's a turbo issue, and after that, the engine starts knocking or losing power for no clear reason. That kind of inconsistency is a massive red flag, especially for anyone who depends on their vehicle to make money or handle long-distance driving. Consumer Reports also points out that dealership support hasn't been great for these engines. Many owners report software updates that temporarily mask problems instead of solving them. The check engine light turns off, the truck runs fine for a few weeks, and then the same issue, or a new one, comes right back. That's not reliability, that's damage control. And once warranties expire, those temporary fixes quickly turn into out-of-pocket repairs that can cost more than the vehicle's current value. Another major issue is downtime. These engines aren't just expensive when they break, they leave you stranded. Consumer Reports data shows higher than average rates of breakdowns that result in towing, loaner vehicles, or weeks-long waits at service centers. In 2026, when parts shortages are still affecting the auto industry, waiting on diesel-specific components can take even longer, turning a single failure into a month-long headache that disrupts work, travel, and daily life. Then there's the resale problem no one talks about at the dealership. Consumer Reports notes that vehicles equipped with these engines are already depreciating faster than similar models with different powertrains. Savvy buyers are avoiding them, trade-in values are dropping, and private sellers are struggling to move them without slashing prices. So even if you think you'll just sell it later, you may find yourself stuck with a vehicle no one wants, or one you have to practically give away. What's especially frustrating is that many of these problems don't show up during a test drive or even the first year of ownership. These engines can feel strong, smooth, and efficient early on. Consumer Reports highlights that the real trouble often starts after 60,000 to 90,000 miles, right when buyers expect a diesel to be hitting its stride. Instead, that's when repair bills start piling up and confidence in the vehicle begins to disappear. And here's the part that should really make you pause. Consumer Reports warns that some of these engines are nearing the point where extended warranties and third-party coverage providers are refusing to offer plans or charging extremely high premiums. That's a clear signal from the industry itself that the risk is high. When warranty companies don't want to touch an engine, it's usually because they've already lost money covering failures in the past. So if you're wondering whether these issues are exaggerated or just a few bad apples, Consumer Reports' answer is very clear. The data shows consistent, widespread problems across multiple model years, different driving conditions, and various ownership types. And as diesel technology becomes more complex rather than simpler, the likelihood of these issues disappearing anytime soon is slim, which is why before you even think about what engine you should buy in 2026, you need to understand what Consumer Reports says about the alternatives that are quietly outperforming these problem diesels. Because while these three engines are dragging owners down, Consumer Reports has identified other powertrains that are quietly doing the opposite, running longer, braking less, and costing far less to live with. And this comparison makes the worst list look even worse. When buyers choose these problem diesels, they're not just accepting risk, they're ignoring better options sitting right next to them on the lot. Consumer Reports highlights that many modern gasoline turbo engines and even hybrid setups are now outperforming these diesels in real-world torque delivery, daily drivability, and long-term ownership costs. That's a hard pill to swallow for diesel loyalists, but the data doesn't lie. In stop-and-go traffic, short trips, and mixed-use driving, these diesel engines struggle with clogged emissions components and region failures, while gas and hybrid alternatives just keep going with minimal drama. Another key point Consumer Reports makes is how driving habits affect failure rates. These worst-ranked diesel engines are especially sensitive to short trips and urban driving, which is exactly how most people actually use their vehicles. Miss a few proper Regan cycles, and suddenly you're dealing with warning lights, reduced power, and forced dealership visits. For 2026 buyers who aren't hauling heavy loads every day, that makes these engines a terrible fit no matter how appealing the torque numbers look in ads. Then there's maintenance complexity. Consumer Reports notes that routine service on these engines is no longer routine. Oil changes require specific low-ash oils, emissions components need regular monitoring, and one skipped service interval can snowball into major failures. Even experienced owners are getting caught off guard by how unforgiving these engines have become, and once something goes wrong, DIY repairs are often impossible due to software locks and specialized diagnostic tools. What really seals the deal is owner satisfaction scores. Consumer Reports shows that these engines rank near the bottom not just in reliability, but in overall happiness. Owners describe constant anxiety, hesitation to take road trips, and fear of towing heavy loads because they never know when the next warning light will appear. That's not what people buy diesel trucks and SUVs for, and it's a massive disconnect between expectation and reality. Consumer Reports also raises concerns about long-term emissions compliance. As inspections become stricter and software updates more frequent, these engines are at higher risk of failing emissions tests or requiring costly updates just to remain road legal. For buyers planning to keep a vehicle for 10 years or more, that uncertainty alone is enough reason to walk away. So if you're serious about buying in 2026, the takeaway from Consumer Reports is simple but powerful. Torque and MPG numbers don't matter if the the engine can't be trusted. The smartest buyers are shifting their focus to proven reliability, simpler systems, and engines with long track records of durability. And before you assume diesel is still the safest long-term bet, wait until you hear which engines Consumer Reports says are actually worth your money, and why one surprising option is beating diesel at its own game. Because when Consumer Reports breaks down the data, one trend becomes impossible to ignore. Diesel is no longer the automatic safe choice it once was. In fact, some of the engines people trust the most are now the ones quietly costing them the least in repairs, stress, and downtime. And that shift is catching a lot of buyers completely off guard. Consumer Reports points out that several naturally aspirated gasoline engines are now reaching high mileage numbers that used to be diesel territory, without the emissions headaches or surprise failures. These engines may not dominate spec sheets, but they win where it matters most: consistency. Owners aren't dealing with regen cycles, def warnings, or sudden limp modes. They just drive, maintain, and move on with their lives, which is exactly what many diesel buyers thought they were signing up for in the first place. What's even more interesting is how modern hybrids are changing the conversation. Consumer Reports shows that some hybrid powertrains are delivering instant low-end torque that rivals small diesels, while dramatically reducing wear on the engine itself. Less stress, fewer moving parts working at high loads, and regenerative braking that reduces overall strain. All of that translates into fewer breakdowns over time. For many 2026 buyers, that combination is starting to look a lot more appealing than gambling on a complex diesel setup. Another detail Consumer Reports highlights is ownership psychology. Once drivers experience multiple diesel-related failures, confidence in the vehicle disappears. Every sound feels suspicious. Every warning message causes panic. That mental burden adds up, and it's something that doesn't show up on a spec sheet or in a brochure. Engines on the worst list consistently create this kind of distrust, which is a major reason satisfaction scores collapse even when the vehicle technically still runs. Then there's the financial trap many owners fall into. Consumer Reports notes that after sinking thousands into repairs, people feel stuck keeping the vehicle because selling it would mean taking a huge loss. So they keep repairing, hoping the next fix will be the last one. Spoiler alert, it rarely is. That cycle drains wallets and patience. And it's exactly why these engines earn such strong warnings instead of mild recommendations. The bigger picture here is that buying a diesel in 2026 requires more research than ever before. Consumer Reports makes it clear that brand reputation alone is no longer enough. Even respected names have produced engines that simply didn't age well under modern regulations and real-world driving habits. Ignoring that reality can turn an exciting purchase into years of regret. And this brings us to the moment every buyer needs to hear before heading to the dealership. If an engine already has a history of widespread issues, it's not going to magically improve in future model years. Software updates can hide problems, and redesigns can take years to fully mature. That's why Consumer Reports strongly advises avoiding these engines entirely rather than hoping you'll get a good one, especially when smarter, more reliable options are already proving themselves, which leads directly into the final warning every 2026 buyer needs to understand before making a decision. Because the final warning from Consumer Reports isn't subtle, it's blunt. If you're buying based on past diesel reputation instead of current data, you're already behind. The market has changed, the technology has changed, and the risks have changed right along with it. And the buyers getting burned in 2026 are often the ones who thought they were making the safe choice. Consumer Reports emphasizes that these worst-rated diesel engines don't fail in isolation. One component goes down, and it stresses the rest of the system. A bad injector leads to excessive soot. Excessive soot clogs the DPF. A clogged DPF overheats the turbo. Suddenly, what started as a manageable repair becomes a full-blown mechanical crisis. This domino effect is exactly why repair costs skyrocket and why so many owners report multiple failures within a short span of time. Another overlooked issue is how these engines age. Consumer Reports notes that wear accelerates sharply after the midlife mark. Hoses harden, sensors degrade, and tolerances tighten just enough to trigger constant faults. These engines don't gracefully decline, they unravel. And once they do, reliability becomes unpredictable, which is the worst possible trait in a vehicle meant to be durable and dependable. Fuel quality also plays a bigger role than most buyers realize. Consumer Reports highlights that these engines are far more sensitive to poor quality diesel and contaminated DEF than older designs. One bad tank can set off weeks of problems, including injector damage and emissions faults that refuse to clear. In regions where fuel quality varies, the risk multiplies, and many owners don't realize what went wrong until the damage is already done. Then there's the issue of technician familiarity. As fewer diesels are sold, fewer techs specialize in diagnosing them correctly. Consumer Reports found that misdiagnosis is common with these engines, leading to unnecessary part replacements that don't solve the root problem. That means higher bills, longer repair times, and repeated visits that leave owners feeling completely helpless. All of this explains why Consumer Reports is so firm about avoiding these engines entirely. This isn't about minor annoyances or picky maintenance. It's about systemic flaws that surface again and again across different owners and conditions. And while some people will always defend their diesel choice, the data shows that many of them simply haven't hit the failure window yet, which is exactly why Consumer Reports urges buyers to think long-term, not emotionally. Ignore the badge, ignore the marketing, ignore the torque bragging rights. Focus on engines with clean reliability histories and predictable ownership costs. Because the worst mistake you can make in 2026 isn't choosing the wrong color or trim. It's locking yourself into an engine that Consumer Reports has already warned you about, especially when the next thing you're about to hear could completely change how you shop for your next vehicle. Because the next thing Consumer Reports reveals is the buying behavior that separates regret from relief. According to their data, the smartest buyers in 2026 aren't chasing maximum specs, they're avoiding maximum risk. They're asking different questions at the dealership, and those questions are saving them thousands before the ink even dries on the contract. Consumer Reports notes that buyers who dig into long-term reliability charts, not just first-year reviews, consistently avoid these worst diesel engines. They look past horsepower headlines and focus on failure frequency, average repair cost, and how problems escalate over time. That's where these engines fall apart, and that's exactly where informed buyers walk away. Another smart move Consumer Reports highlights is walking away from great deals on diesel models. Heavy discounts often signal inventory that's hard to move, not generosity. When you see a diesel truck priced well below similar models, there's usually a reason, and Consumer Reports data shows those reasons often resurface after purchase in the form of repairs. A lower monthly payment means nothing when the engine becomes a financial sinkhole. Leasing versus buying is another trap. Consumer Reports warns that some people lease these diesels to avoid long-term risk, but that strategy can backfire. Emissions issues don't care about lease terms, and downtime still costs you time, convenience, and sometimes money. Even short-term ownership can be stressful when warning lights, reduced power, and dealer visits become part of the routine. Consumer Reports also points out how online hype keeps these engines alive. Influencers talk about towing numbers and MPG, but rarely stick around long enough to report what happens at 80,000 miles. Real owners do, and their reports are what drive these rankings. That disconnect between hype and reality is exactly how bad engines continue to sell year after year. What really changes perspectives is when buyers compare total ownership cost over 5 to 8 years. Consumer Reports shows that these worst diesel engines often end up costing more than premium gasoline vehicles once repairs, downtime, and depreciation are factored in. At that point, the original reason for choosing diesel completely collapses. And this leads to one unavoidable conclusion Consumer Reports keeps reinforcing. If an engine requires constant defense from its owners, that's a warning sign in itself. Reliable engines don't need excuses. They don't need forums explaining away failures. They just work. And as more buyers catch on to that reality, the market is slowly shifting away from these problem diesels, especially as 2026 approaches and buyers become more cautious, more informed, and far less willing to gamble on engines that Consumer Reports has already placed on the avoid list. And as that shift accelerates, Consumer Reports makes it clear that the fallout for these worst diesel engines is only going to get worse. Manufacturers aren't rushing to redesign them from the ground up. Instead, they're patching problems with software updates, revised components, and quiet changes that don't erase the damage already done to their reliability records. For buyers in 2026, that means you're stepping into an experiment that's already failed multiple rounds of testing. Consumer Reports also highlights a growing gap between expectation and ownership reality. Diesel buyers expect confidence, the feeling that the engine will handle whatever you throw at it without complaint. But But with these engines, owners report driving defensively, constantly monitoring gauges, listening for odd sounds, and planning routes around dealership access just in case something goes wrong. That's not empowerment, that's anxiety, and it's becoming the defining trait of ownership for these powertrains. One of the most damaging long-term effects Consumer Reports points out is brand trust erosion. When an engine repeatedly lets owners down, it doesn't just hurt that model, it poisons future buying decisions. Many owners who've experienced these failures say they'll never buy another diesel, even from a different manufacturer. That kind of backlash reshapes the entire market, and it's one of the reasons diesel options are quietly shrinking every year. There's also the issue of repair transparency. Consumer Reports notes that many fixes for these engines aren't permanent solutions. Some are temporary workarounds designed to meet emissions requirements rather than restore durability. Owners leave the dealership thinking the problem is solved, only for it to resurface months later in a slightly different form. Over time, this creates a sense that the engine is always one failure away from disaster, even when it's technically running fine. Another warning Consumer Reports stresses is how these engines perform once they're out of warranty and out of favor. As fewer of them remain on the road, parts availability becomes inconsistent, prices rise, wait times grow, independent shops become hesitant to work on them. What was once a mainstream powertrain slowly becomes a niche liability, and owners feel that shift every time they need service. And here's the reality check that hits hardest. Diesel ownership only makes sense when reliability is exceptional. Without that foundation, the entire value proposition collapses. Consumer Reports data shows that these worst engines don't just miss the mark, they undermine the very reason diesel exists in the first place. High torque means nothing if you can't trust the engine to start, pull, and finish the job. For 2026 buyers, the message couldn't be clearer. Avoid engines with proven, repeated failures. Avoid platforms where owners spend more time troubleshooting than driving, and avoid the temptation to believe that this year is different when the long-term data says otherwise. Consumer Reports didn't publish this list to scare buyers. It published it to save them from regret. Because at the end of the day, the worst feeling isn't paying more upfront for the right engine. The worst feeling is realizing you ignored the warning signs, bought into the hype, and ended up owning a vehicle that fights you every step of the way. And that's exactly what Consumer Reports is trying to prevent by shining a spotlight on these 3 diesel engines. So when you're standing on that dealership lot in 2026, you know exactly which engines to walk past without a second thought.